Welcome to DentReviews. Today I'm going to do a quick audio review of the ER3 and ER4 series earphones. I've already done some other videos of the product itself, physical differences, boxing, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to focus here on the audio quality itself and kind of the differences between them. Hopefully in this review, my goal would be that the end result is that you can get an idea of how they compare to each other and maybe how they compare to what you're looking for in a sound signature. And then from there, you could decide which one you might like and make the right decision based on your budget and the sound, request of sound that you're looking for. I have a lot of experience in studios, music studios, on studio monitors and treated rooms, and I've had a lot of different speakers in my life, and earphones and headphones, and I'm not saying that makes me more or less suited to tell you what references or not, but I'm just saying that so you have an idea of what I'm, coming from. Now, most studio engineers would agree that an ideal sound is a studio monitor that has a flat measured response in an acoustically treated room. Now, if that's the case, which is what I'm going to use as my basis here, the Etymotic earphones, starting with the ER4S, do a very good job representing that sound in an earphone. The basic tonality is the same, but you end up with a slight difference in certain parts of the frequency spectrum. So, for instance, the main problem with the ER series of earphones that most people have said over the years is that they lack bass. They sound thin, they sound bright, whatever you want to call it. I don't find that that's necessarily true myself. However, I would agree that they are not at the ideal reference level of sub-bass. The bass and mid-bass, I think, are. The sub-bass is where it really would improve them. If they could make even just one more model where they were able to correct that a little bit, it would be phenomenal. But that's the ER4S. In the 2 kilohertz region, there's just a slight bump, and I'd say the bass here, that's about 50, it's like -5 decibels at 50 hertz to me. And then up here, maybe at 10 kilohertz, so you have these slight bumps. Now, there might be a little bit more unevenness throughout the response, and especially in the treble, because measurements are hard to really gauge the upper treble accurately. Needless to say, this is the overall tonality from the ER4S. You get a very neutral overall signature with a slight dip in the bass, low bass, and these slight bumps. Now, for most people that have had the ER4S for a long time, you're probably not going to hear a drastic difference in the ER4SR. However, for me personally, the comfort, the fit, the style, the cable, all the properties of the earphone itself make it worth having over the S for me personally. But what you're going to find, what I find in my opinion, is that the frequency response is practically identical. However, there's something in the property of the sound, I don't know what it is, but I'm going to say it makes the bass sound just unbelievably ever so slightly more present. The 2 kilohertz sounds ever so slightly lower, and the 10 kilohertz might as well. But for the sake of comparisons, let's just say they're practically identical. The ER4XR, on the other hand, adds a boost in the bass. However, it creeps up into the mid-bass a little bit more. So that around, I'm going to say 500 hertz maybe, somewhere around there. Again, this is all from memory and just listening. But from 500 hertz to about 50 hertz, again, my opinion is that it shouldn't be boosted at all. It's really, let's say, below 100 hertz, it should start an upward curve that goes into the sub bass. Now, that could be due to technical reasons. It's just hard to achieve, and maybe they just didn't want something so close to the ER4S that they wanted a slight difference for people to, have alternate bass configuration. Whatever. Needless to say, the perfect bass, in my opinion, would be somewhere between the two. Now, what the ER3 has done is that the sound was close, but they basically have the same exact bass response, but the treble at 2 kilohertz starts sort of a downward slope. Now, it's good and bad. What you have is essentially the same treble as the ER4SR, but it's not perfectly evenly dropped. In other words, it's not just a straight tilt. There is a little bit of unevenness to the tilt. Now, for all intents and purposes, what you're achieving with that tilt is a warmer, slightly more relaxed ER4SR. That's really what it comes down to. The bass is identical in response, I think, although the overall weight of the bass gets a little bit more of a presence boost because of the treble shift. So things sound a little bit more weightier, if you want to call it that, but only by a very slight amount. The real difference I hear is that the treble becomes a little bit maybe drier sounding and a little bit more relaxed, so it's not as in your face. Now this is still an ER4, so again, these are very small differences. And then with the ER4 XR, you had the bass, whereas the ER3 XR has that same bass boost, but it also has that treble drop of the ER3 SE. So the ER3 XR has the tilt, kind of the whole spectrum, kind of downward from the bass to the treble. The ER4 SR, you could almost say, if you were really, really exaggerating, would be tilted upwards. So, you know, let's just say you had a perfect line here. Just for comparison's sake, the ER4 SR would kind of be like that. Whoops, that was supposed to be in the middle of the line, but whatever. The ER3 SR would probably be closer to, you know, that. The ER4 XR would be more like that, and then the 3XR would be like that. And again, this is just all mumbo jumbo, but the idea being that the sound is similar enough that it's almost just a slightly different flavor with each earphone. I believe, this is my personal opinion, that the ER4S is probably still the reference. I still think that probably has the utmost best quality. That's just my opinion. The SR is so close, they're almost identical, but I just think that even if the S is a little bit better, the SR's form factor, cable, everything else that goes along with it, for me personally, I don't know why, but it does fit in my ear easily, and that's a fact. I've switched back and forth many times, and I just get an easier insert and seal with the SR for whatever reason. Even if they're physically identical, there's something about that. So that, for me, makes this more consistent, more comfortable, so I'll pick that. So with that said, the SR being my favorite, the S being, you know, up there with quality, the next in line would probably be a tie between the ER4XR and 3SE. The reason is the XR provides that little bit more bass weight, where the SE gives you the relaxed treble, but again, because they're essentially, one's tilting the bass and one's dropping the treble, you know, they kind of have a similar overall tilt. The difference is where that point at which they tilt is. With the SE, it starts at 2 kilohertz and drops. With the 4XR, it starts around 500 hertz and goes up as it lowers down to the bass. So the ER4XR, in my opinion, has less overall change to the sound in terms of where that point is. It doesn't bleed up into the overall tonality as much, but it also has a larger increase of decibel increase of bass, whereas the XR might have 5 or 6 decibels more bass or something like that. The SE only has 2 or 3 decibels cut, so it might go further down into the mids, but it's not as drastic of a change. So it makes it very hard for me to choose between the two. If I had to pick only one right this instant, I'd probably say the XR, because the treble's identical to the SR, but you get the boosted bass. Whereas the SE would probably be my favorite, except the treble dip, again, isn't perfectly smooth. It's slightly uneven, and that causes a little bit of lack in that nice, smooth, silky 2 kilohertz region. So there's some sound that is missing, like a little bit of magic, I guess you could say, from the ER4S series is kind of missing in that SE because of that treble drip. But it's so slight that it's still an Etymotic, and I would still, hands down, take any 4 of these over any other earphone, no questions asked. However, the last model, the ER3 XR, is probably the model that, if I had a choice, I would just never use that. I would say it's the SR, and then the 4XR 3SE would be my second option, and then the 3XR would be my last option. It's just a little bit too much in that tilt, a little bit too much bass versus, you know, relative to the treble. That gives it a little bit more of a subdued high end, a little bit more soft sound. and just it lacks the overall openness that I like in the other models. So what it comes down to, I think, for a lot of people is going to be budget. So do you have 150 bucks, 180 bucks? I think, in my opinion, the 3SC is the way to go, and don't even hesitate. It's phenomenal, it's awesome, and it's not that much different from all the others. If you have an extra 100 bucks, 150 bucks, I think at that point it comes down to whether or not you want more true accuracy at the cost of a little bit of bass, or if you really are looking to have a full low end and you don't want to sacrifice that bass. And that really comes down to it. The 4XR gives you that low bass without really sacrificing hardly any of the treble. And the SR gives you that perfectly neutral sound, while maybe only in your mind, if you're looking at that neutrality as key, you might only be losing a little bit of sub bass. And a lot of people think it still has phenomenal sub bass. I'm one of those people. I don't EQ my ER4SR when I listen to it. I think it sounds phenomenal. But it could benefit from a little bit of sub bass boost. So it really comes down to budget, I think. If you look into the specifications of each model, none of them differ greatly in terms of total harmonic distortion. They're all the same isolation. They're very, very similar in every way. It's just the frequency response is slightly different in terms of its tonality, just the characteristics. I call them a tuning. So like I'd say each one of these has a slightly different tuning. If you want the bassy warm tuning, you go with the XRSC. If you want the relatively accurate neutrality, you go with the SSR. If you really are coming from a drastically different earphone, that's the one time I'd say you might want the ER3 XR, because relative to other earphones, it's not a bassy earphone. Relative to other earphones, it's probably you're gonna find it to be very accurate, and you're gonna find it very revealing, and you might just fall in love with it. But for those who really are looking for a truly transparent and neutral sound, and they're familiar with studio monitor speakers or other neutral earphones to begin with, you might want to lean towards these other models, whereas this might come on just a little bit too soft or too bassy. So that's kind of the overall sound quality impressions that I get. They all have incredibly low distortion. Some people say that the SR has lower distortion than the XR, in that they hear that, and even some popular reviewers out there have said, you know, the XR, there's just something about it, it's not as smooth as the SR. I'm going to be honest, I don't hear it. I think the smoothness that the SR portrays is a lot to do with the frequency response. I think there's so much that can be said about frequency response that people downplay all the time on forums, and they say it's not the most important things, graphs don't matter, blah, 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 blah. Well, in my opinion, the graphs is the #1 important thing. It's not the only thing, absolutely not. Of course, there's many other factors, but it's the single most important thing. You could give me an earphone with the best isolation and noise levels ever, and if the frequency response is all over the chart, I'm not even going to want to hear it. It's just, it won't sound good. Now, if everything is relatively similar, then yes, having a high distortion value is going to make this sound worse. But both the SR and the XR are well below what is considered generally the threshold of hearing. If you got the XR to 1% distortion, that means you're driving that thing so loud you're going to be deaf. And I just would tell you right now, turn it down. Otherwise, you should be running in the 0.5%, maybe 0.75%. And most well-known sources, I'll say, have said that anything below 1% is inaudible. I won't say that that's true or not. Some people might hear it at 8.8%, but the point is that both of these are incredibly low, so you're really not going to run into that. I don't have measurement specifications on the 3 series, but in my listening test, I have heard no loss of details or smoothness, so I don't believe the distortion is any noticeably higher. And if it is, it's probably still within that threshold of the 1% at really high volumes. So I think overall these are probably the best earphones that I have ever heard. Yes, there are other earphones, multi-driver, custom, this and that, and they all have different signatures, and some people may love the signatures and prefer them. But I'm just coming from the point of view of an accurate studio sound, and what I personally enjoy is that accurate studio sound. Now, in an ideal world, I would want an ER4 SR that has more sub bass. That's my opinion, but that doesn't exist. So I kind of struggle between these 3 models, and I always just kind of switch and go back and forth, and maybe someday I'll settle on one. But for now, I'd say I always go back to the SR at some point. I may say, well, I really do like the relaxing sound of the ER4XR, and I prefer it overall. But then there's times where I really want to hear the SR again. It always comes back to the SR. And with EQ, it's phenomenal, but I just don't really bother with it anymore. It's just so close. It doesn't matter to me. I listen to it un-EQ'd. But EQing the sub bass of the SR does sound phenomenal, and just talking about it is making me want to do it again and start listening to it like that. I would usually just put a slight EQ around 40 to 50 hertz with just a very quick roll off back at 0 around 100 hertz, and just boost it maybe 5 or 6 decibels, so that at roughly at 5 decibels around 50 hertz is where I try to aim. And it's not a drastic difference, but there are songs where you say, wow, that sounds so good. And if you A-B between that EQ, you'll say, okay, it still sounds great, but I hear where that's missing that bass thump, that bass body, that bass depth that you would get with a speaker. Maybe not translated perfectly, but you know, you might hear what that is missing. So in my opinion, the SR with a little bit of EQ in the sub bass is the ideal target that I wish they could make into a permanent tone in an earphone. But this is my opinion. You know, from my other reviews, they have the best isolation. The noise is incredibly low. Distortion is low. There's no hiss on any of my models with most players. The sensitivity of the new models is a little bit better. They're louder at any given volume than the original S. And the ER3, I believe, is even a little bit louder than the ER4 SR and XR at any given volume, but it's pretty close. I think what you're really getting in terms of quality between the 3 and the 4 series is, I know from Etymotic that the ER3 series is made in China, and that is a huge way to cut the costs, I think. It's just the manufacturing alone. And the tolerances are not matched as well. I don't want to say that they're not matched as well, they're just not as tightly controlled. So you might get 5 pairs of ER3, and they just might deviate a little bit more between pairs than the ER4. They may not. I mean, it's all just chance, because the ER4 has a very tight quality control, a very tight channel matching, whereas the ER3 is made in China, and that stuff is not as critical. Now, in my opinion, the ER3s I have the ER3 SE and the XR, so I've had 2 of them. In my opinion, both of those sounded every bit as good as the 4. I didn't hear any noticeable channel differences between left and right. I didn't hear any noticeable frequency differences between left and right. So if there were they were measured of such a slight amount that it didn't matter to me. So if you care about that and you're concerned, they're going to guarantee you that with the 4, and they're going to get a graph to prove it. With the 3, you're not going to get a graph. You're not going to be guaranteed that. So you're getting a little bit less peace of mind. It's made in China, if that matters to you, whereas these are not. So that's really how they're cutting the cost. But just pure Etymotic quality, if you can't afford the 4, don't even hesitate with the 3. The sound quality is phenomenal. So I'm just going to leave it there and say that all 4 models, or all 5, are superb. The only other one I didn't talk about is the B, and the B is basically an ER4S, but the treble tilts upward, not that much, but it tilts upward, you know, in the higher treble. So for binaural recordings and certain things, it sounds great. And I kind of wish one day they would make an ER4 XRB. I think that would be so cool, because the treble of the B is actually very good if you get an awesome deep seal. But it does give an overall brightness to the tonality of the earphone, which I like in a lot of instances, but as a whole, I don't think it compares as well to the SR or the 4XR. I think those have better treble response. But with the additional bass of the XR giving the sound a slightly U-shape, I think that would give a very nice sound signature that a lot of people would probably really like, myself included. So I'm really curious if they're ever going to make an ER4 XRB. That would be the next one that I sadly would probably buy, and then I'd own every Etymotic ever made. And then the P obviously was just the ER4S, but with a subdued treble, because of the impedance from the resistor, the difference in value. Now the P versus the SE is an interesting comparison. I'd say they're similar in the fact that they have lower treble, but I think personally that the ER4 SE has a smaller change and it's a more gradual change. So I think that 3SE is a more accurate earphone in my personal opinion. It's been a long time since I've heard the S without the adapter, like the P version, so I'd have to go back and do a side-by-side comparison, but I think if it were me personally, I would take the SE over the P any day. And then I would obviously take the SR over all those, and you've kind of heard me say all this. I'm just reiterating myself. Hopefully I've gone into enough to kind of give you an idea of how they differ. In terms of songs, I think what you're going to find is the 3XR, you might have a lot more weight in the bass end, but it's going to be at the cost of having a little bit of that treble clarity and dynamic detail, kind of more soft. The SE is going to be very neutral like the S series, but what you're getting with the 3SE is a little bit more relaxed sound, and some details might come across as sharper, not necessarily better or more detailed, but sharper, like a little bit more upper treble, because that curve, again, that drops down in the treble isn't exactly even. You end up with a little bit of that 10 kilohertz and stuff that may not be dropped as much as some of the other areas, so it kind of dries out the treble just a touch, and sometimes that's nice. You get a little bit more like background harmonies in a song, for instance. In my opinion, I think they stand out better in the 3SE. I think that I hear individual voices better in the 3SE. But then, if I'm listening to a song that has pads and keyboards, I believe the SR represents those at a more neutral and accurate level than the SE, whereas they feel a little bit more subdued in the background in the SE. The SR gives you that like creamy smoothness in the treble. So the XR retains all that, but just, again, comparatively makes things a little bit softer, so that if you were listening to a trance or electronic song, you get awesome clarity and awesome dynamics in the treble, but it just might come across as a little bit less open and a little bit less dynamic than the SR. Whereas the SR, all the details are going to jump out at you and sound the clearest and sound the best, but you're not going to get as much of that low thump and that low body that you'd get with a deep sub bass in a track like a BT song or something like that. So, you know, for instance, Steely Dan, I've talked about before, all his instrumentation really kind of pops out and jumps out on the SR. The SE, it has a very similar effect, but you get a little bit more of a dark tonality to it. The XR, it still sounds great. I mean, it's Steely Dan, it's an Etymotic earphone, but it just sounds softer, and then the XR sounds the softest. So I think if you want the best representation of music, the SR is the way to go, with all those caveats that I've said. It all depends on where you're coming from, what you're expecting, what you're willing to spend, and how familiar you are with the Etymotic series. But given the time I've had with all these, I think this is really the decision that I've settled on as kind of my final decision, and that may change in the future, but I really think the SR is the best, XR, 4XR, and 3SE are the second best, and the 3XR is the last, with the 4S being a special kind of super quality, but just not as good in every other way. So that's my final review of the sound quality of the Etymotic earphones. If you have any questions, leave them below. I hope I've answered some questions you might have had, but if you have any more, just leave me some below, and I can always make another review later. And as always, thank you guys for watching.